Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight. I'm Paris Schutz.
And I'm Brandis Friedman. On the show tonight,
it gives them a fundamental right to collectively bargain.
Unions and business clash over a possible change to the state constitution. What voters should know.
Protests in Iran and around the globe after the death of a 22-year-old woman accused of violating the country's conservative dress code. We have local reaction.
There's a crisis that is unfolding along the Lake Michigan shoreline.
As a coal-fired power plant in Indiana goes offline, some advocates say cleanup efforts are incomplete and put the region's water supply at risk.
A U.S. task force is recommending for the first time adults under 65 get screened for anxiety.
A spacecraft deliberately hits an asteroid. NASA's moon mission is postponed, and other space news as we look to the stars.
Could it finally be time to move to downtown Chicago without breaking the bank? That and more business headlines from Craves.
This happened because the people in this community came together and said, this is what we want to do.
And a Northwest Side Park is rededicated to honor a German Jewish poet who died in the Holocaust. But first, some of today's top stories. A man is shot at the Chicago Police Department's Homan Square facility on the city's west side after allegedly pointing guns at officers in a bizarre incident this morning. Police Superintendent David Brown says a man climbed a fire escape and entered the 5th floor of the building where officers were undergoing SWAT training. He then allegedly seized at least 2 guns being used for the training from a table.
The offender, points those guns at officers and is fired upon and struck by one of the officers. And he is the offender is in the hospital recovering from non-life-threatening injuries.
The Civilian Office of Police Accountability is investigating the incident. 7 people were killed and more than 30 others wounded in shootings across the city of Chicago over the weekend. Chicago police say 38 people were shot in 27 separate shooting incidents between 6 p.m. Friday and 11:59 p.m. Sunday. That includes an 18-year-old killed Saturday afternoon and 2 men killed at a North Lawndale home on Sunday. Mayor Lori Lightfoot unveils a plan she hopes will breathe new life into Chicago's financial district by reimagining it as the city's newest residential neighborhood. Lightfoot says she is determined to chart a, quote, bright and lasting future for LaSalle Street between Washington and Jackson, an area of the city she says has been permanently altered by shifts triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic.
We want to engage the current owners of buildings, the current stakeholders, and say, give us your best ideas about what you think you can do with your buildings to make them attractive, to recognize the history, but do so with an eye towards equity.
The mayor says the city will offer subsidies to developers willing to transform outdated office space into 1,000 new residential units. But the catch for developers is that they would be required to set aside 30% of the new units for low and moderate income residents. Up next, a deep dive into a state constitutional amendment on the ballot in November. Stay with us.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Alexandra and John Nichols, the Jim and Kay Mabey family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
Voters can start to cast their ballots for the November election this week. Early voting begins Thursday. Among the choices voters will have to make is whether to add a new amendment to the Illinois Constitution. Amanda Vinicky joins us now with more on what it would do. Amanda.
Brandis, this will actually be right at the top of your ballot, and for good reason. That's because, yes, it would, if it passes, change the state constitution by adding to it these words. It would give employees the fundamental right to organize and to bargain collectively and forbid any law that interferes with that. Now, unions are making a big push for voters to agree to the change. Head of the Illinois AFL-CIO, Tim Dre, says it would be a game changer for workers.
A person spends nearly a majority of their life at work. that it's, that this is a fundamental, those rights, those workers' rights need to be included in the Constitution so that they're preserved. I mean, we certainly wouldn't give the right to free speech or the right to worship how you please or any other rights, just saying, we'll leave it up to state statute.
Trey says former Illinois Governor Bruce Rauner's attempts to curtail prevailing wage laws and to make Illinois a right-to-work state were a wake-up call. Trey says this is protection from future potential political whims. Now, by and large, Rauner was not successful, though the Illinois-based Janus U.S. Supreme Court decision did weaken public unions some. Now, unlike right-to-work states, Illinois private companies can still require employees to join a union as a condition of employment.
We know the political winds here in Illinois. We know that Illinois is not going to join Indiana, Wisconsin, Michigan, Iowa, and Kentucky as right-to-work states anytime soon. We know that. But why enshrine it in the Constitution when it just sends a message out to everyone who might be looking to invest in Illinois about where our priorities really lie?
Head of the State Chamber of Commerce, Todd Meisch, says that message that unions are the priority over job creators. He says that the amendment is going to hurt the economy. But Joe Bauer, who does communications for the group campaigning for passage of this amendment, says investing in the workforce attracts businesses. He says boosting wages will boost state revenues as well as that of private businesses.
We know when working people do better that they don't just buy stocks. They buy dinner in local restaurants. They pick up a cup of coffee from a local shop. And that spending doesn't just benefit those families and those small businesses. It really contributes to their local community as well as our entire state. Voting yes for the Workers' Rights Amendment will help us put more money in the pockets of working families.
But another criticism is based on one of those phrases. It specifies what unions can bargain about, expanding it actually. So not just typical things like wages and hours, working conditions, but also economic welfare. And critics say that term is really broad and that it could give teachers and other public unions more room to go on strike, make it easier for them to walk out. That's one of the criticisms of Miley Smith, who does labor advocacy for the right-leaning think tank, the Illinois Policy Institute. Smith says that most of this amendment will actually only apply to public sector unions because national labor law will take precedence. But she says this is going to lead to a whole patchwork of lawsuits.
What we will probably see first is patchwork litigation while unions try to implement some of these new rights in the private sector, and employers are going to have to fight that out in litigation.
She also says that as unions are able to bargain over more, they'll have more power. Again, this is getting back to that economic welfare term. She says that's going to get expensive.
Government contracts will cost more. These expanded subjects will make negotiations cost more. They will make the contract that is negotiated cost more, and that will be passed on to the taxpayers to pay for it.
But union leader Dre says there are no big plans to do something major if the amendment passes. Again, he says this is about protecting current rights.
Yes, labor will always be in there building upon it. As technology changes and things happen, we're always going to build on workers' rights, but we don't have any nefarious plan to go in and take over the world with this amendment.
Democrats in the state legislature voted for this, and that's how it got on the November ballot. But it's up to voters whether it becomes part of the state constitution's Bill of Rights. And it is sort of confusing here, two ways that that'll happen. To be added to the Constitution, it either needs yes votes from 3/5 of those who vote on the proposal, or from a majority of all voters who cast ballots in the November election, even if they skip this particular question. Brenda, back to you.
Amanda, thank you. And now to Paris and the worldwide uproar, including here in Chicago, over a death in Iran. Paris.
Brandis, protests took place this weekend in Chicago, but have especially erupted in Iran after the death of a 22-year-old woman at the hands of what is known as the morality police. The woman was arrested while visiting family for not wearing a hijab, traditional headscarf. Her death has caused an outcry around the world denouncing Iran for violations of women's rights. And joining us to break down the unrest in Iran are Jacqueline Saper, an Iranian-American writer, activist, and author of From Miniskirt to Hijab; Ali Tarok, a former political prisoner turned activist; and Matteo Mohammed Farzaneh, associate professor of history at Northeastern Illinois University and author of Iranian Women and Gender in the Iran-Iraq War. Welcome all of you to Chicago tonight. Jacqueline Saper, let's start with the basics. Remind us who the morality police in Iran are.
Yes, good evening. The morality police have been roaming the streets of the cities of Iran and the neighborhoods, enforcing the decree of forced and mandatory hijab. They have instilled fear in the women. I myself had an encounter with morality police. I was walking, minding my own business. I was in a public park, no threat to anyone, and I was stopped by the morality police. I was called a bloody whore and for causing social corruption on the streets of the city, and given a lecture on modesty. And I saw the patrol van, and I did not want to be taken by the police, so I apologized profusely, and I said I will definitely be careful and wear the hijab properly, and I was let go with a warning. But obviously, Mahsa Amini was not that fortunate.
And so the brutal tactics here in your account and in the account here, because the allegations are that she died at the hands of the morality police. Officially, Iranian officials have said that she died of a heart attack, which most Iranians are very skeptical of that. Matteo Farzaneh, there have been violations of women's rights, of human rights in Iran before. Why do you think this has resonated?
Well, this has simply resonated because of the sheer violence, and probably technology has a lot to do with it. Everybody's got a cell phone and they're recording all of this because the state media does not allow for the recording or the reporting of any of these atrocities that are launched against women. So I think technology both, and you have a new generation of Iranian women that I write about all the time, that these people are not like the previous generations. They're quite emboldened, they're very brave. Although we've had brave women before, but they totally operate under different circumstances right now.
And Ali Tarok, you organized a rally here in Chicago. There have been rallies around the world. Do these things resonate? Do they help the cause in Iran?
First, thank you for having me here, and I want to send my condolences to Amini's family in Iran and Kurdistan and all Iranian people. Of course, we are not in the battle in Iran. We cannot fight over there for our freedom and democracy, but we need to show our support. All Iranians, not only Iranians, every single human being in this world who is seeking freedom, human rights, needs to support that that protest in Iran. So this is the smallest things we can do here in Chicago, United States.
Jacqueline Saper, the government ostensibly has also backed some pro-government rallies in Iran. Are those grassroots at all, or are those all basically put on by the government?
By the government. I assure you they're put on by the government. The majority of the people don't want this regime. I was on Chicago tonight when Qasem Soleimani was assassinated. And I was told thousands of millions of people were in the street. And I said that even if 8 million go in the street, is only 10% of the population. And not only these protests have been so widespread, the certain cities like Kerman, where Qasem Soleimani's home birth city is, they are protesting. The holy city of Qom, they're protesting. That's the cradle of the revolution. That's the cradle of the regime. So you can see how widespread this is and the discontent of the people. And in these protests, everyone, young and old, rich and poor, urban and rural, of different ethnicities and beliefs, This is a very widespread protest that is very different to prior years.
Matteo Farzani, and you say this is different than prior years. There was a 2009 Green Revolution. Is there a diplomatic role here for the U.S. that can help in any way, or should this just sort of remain grassroots to Iran?
Well, to answer your question directly, and then I want to add something to that I just said previously. I think this should remain grassroots. I don't think anybody can have any positive role in it simply because then the protesters will be given the label that they're working operatives for the enemy of the state, quote unquote. So it's important that it remains as a grassroots movement. The thing that I wanted to add was, you asked about why these women are behaving the way they are. Why is the government launching the kind of violence that they're doing now? The population, in the entire population, I was just in Iran for 2 months over the summer. The economic situation, lack of prosperity, lack of hope for the great majority of Iranians, not just for women and not for young women, is for everybody across the board. It's so bad that people have basically, in layman's term, have nothing to lose. In essence, it's a point of frustration. And that's when we can talk about the American hand in the worsening of the situation for the Iranians because of the sanctions that President Trump basically snapped back on. The situation has gotten much, much worse than it was before. I travel regularly, and it's never been as bad as what I saw this past summer.
You're talking about sanctions after former President Trump pulled out of the Iranian nuclear deal, which is still being negotiated. So that's part of the whole diplomatic picture here. Ali Tarok, Iran officials, they got rid of internet for the population. Are you hearing anything on the ground in Iran?
Before I answer this question, I want to go back to your question to Jacqueline. The battle is about who takes over the streets. So for many years, we are used to that regime take over the streets and dispatch the forces to show, hey, I have enough support. Okay, I'm legitimate. Okay, at least send good positive energy to its supporters. However, this time is different. Okay, people are in the middle of the battle. Okay, they are telling everybody whose streets are streets. So we are fighting to take our streets back because over there is our house, our country, our cities. So Mahsa Amini could be my sister. Mahsa Amini could be my mother. Mahsa Amini's death could happen to all of us. So then go back to your question to me about the internet. Yeah, it's kind of scary because the regime shut down the internet. There is intranet. They have access to internal website. I haven't heard anything back from my friends. Just yesterday, I called them over the phone, not WhatsApp or other social media. Hey, are you okay? Are you still alive? So one of the things we can support Iranians this time when the regime shut down the internet, we in freedom, in the free countries, we can help people inside Iran to connect to the global internet.
And I know there are efforts to try and do that. We have to leave it there for now. Our thanks to Jacqueline Saper, Ali Tarok, and Matteo Mohammed Farzaneh. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
As a century-old power plant on the shores of Lake Michigan shuts down, some residents and activists are warning the region's water supply could be in danger. Over the next few years, Northern Indiana Public Service Company, or NIPSCO, is retiring the 130-acre Michigan City generating station, which has been burning coal for electricity for nearly a century. It's also cleaning up decades of coal ash byproduct. As Chicago Tonight's Nick Blumberg reports, advocates say the coal ash NIPSCO plans to leave on the site puts groundwater and Lake Michigan itself in danger of contamination in Michigan City and beyond.
Michigan City is about 40 miles from downtown as the crow flies. Right next to the Indiana Dunes on the south shore of Lake Michigan, it's also home to NIPSCO's very first electric generating station.
It will also be the last coal-fired facility that we'll have on our system that's retiring by 2026, 2028 timeframe.
As the utility moves toward renewable energy, it's undertaking a mandatory cleanup of coal ash, the byproduct from burning coal for power. Coal ash can contain arsenic, lead, mercury, and more.
Historically, the industry practice was to take that material, put it in a settling pond so it's not getting airborne. Eventually, we were transporting that down to a landfill. So there's still material that's there from that historical practice.
NIPSCO says it's removing more than 300,000 cubic yards of coal ash from 5 settling ponds, with work scheduled to wrap up by the end of this year.
Everything within the brew of coal ash is really toxic and carcinogenic.
Ashley Williams leads the group Just Transition Northwest Indiana.
We're worried about lithium and arsenic and all of that that's leaking into the groundwater and ultimately into our lake.
Williams says NIPSCO's efforts aren't going far enough. Her group's analysis of NIPSCO data argues there could be millions of tons of coal ash left on the site, much of it in so-called made land, a mixture of the ash and material like sand and dirt. Her group and others want the utility to remove all the coal ash on the site.
The folks that have been calling for further cleanup, the way they tend to phrase it is that you're cleaning up about 10% of what's on this site. What's your reaction to that?
Yeah, I mean, we're actually cleaning up 100% of what we believe the issue is. So related to the coal ash ponds, made land was really not unique to this site. It really exists across much of the Great Lakes.
But Donita Scully, a nurse and the Environmental and Climate Justice Chair for the LaPorte County NAACP, says it's felt acutely in Michigan City.
The individuals that are most affected by this coal ash pollution and its contaminants are African Americans, black and brown, and those individuals who are poor. In Michigan City, about 30% of the population is black, right? And so we have a large proportion of individuals who are poor.
Advocates worry about coal ash seeping into groundwater and that the nearly century-old wall keeping the made land out of Lake Michigan could start leaking or even collapse. An analysis of the site commissioned by the group Earth Justice found corrosion has and continues to undermine the integrity of the steel sheet pile walls. Just Transition Northwest Indiana has taken video it says shows that the wall is already in disrepair.
If the seawall fails, it's not going to only affect minorities or black and brown and poor. It's going to affect all of us.
NIPSCO disputes the reports on the made land and the seawall. Nick Meyer says the steel is not in imminent danger of failing and that it'll be monitored and regulated by state and federal environmental agencies for decades.
They ultimately make the decision or determination, what is, acceptable risk, what is safe and ultimately protective for the community, for the environment.
But groups in Northwest Indiana say the oversight is lacking. The LaPorte County and state NAACP groups, Earth Justice, and others have filed suit against the EPA, arguing the current coal ash regulations are allowing hundreds of dangerous and leaking toxic dumps to escape critical safeguards.
The rules are still a bit in flux.
Mark Templeton leads the Abrams Environmental Law Clinic at UChicago and says there's been a lot of regulatory back and forth over the coal ash rule currently in place, which came after a 2008 spill in Tennessee.
More than 1 billion gallons of coal ash waste basically breached and flooded 300 acres nearby, went into local waterways. Tennessee River killed lots and lots of fish.
Templeton says as more coal-fired plants go offline, it's key to remember how climate change and more extreme weather might affect leftover coal ash, especially since so many generating stations are located near waterways.
We're seeing 100-year flood events occur a couple times a decade, right? So the engineering needs to take this into consideration.
Kay Nelson directs environmental affairs for the Northwest Indiana Forum, an economic development group that works with NIPSCO. She says cleanup, remediation, and protecting Lake Michigan have been and will be key to the region. But she says industry is too.
We still demand their services, and so we need to understand that they are doing what they do, and they're doing it well in compliance with their permits. When the industrialization era began, we thought Mother Earth could handle it all. And then we learned that it couldn't continue in that fashion, and we've spent the last 50 years or so making changes.
But some advocates still say those changes are inadequate.
My hope is that the EPA will consciously consider their rule and change it and make NIPSCO cleanup 100%.
For Chicago Tonight, I'm Nick Blumberg.
Another unresolved question, who should pay for the Michigan City cleanup? NIPSCO wants to raise rates to help cover the $40 million cost, but so far, the Indiana agency representing utility customers has recommended against that. There's a hearing tomorrow morning in Indianapolis to hear evidence as part of that request. And up next, a star-crossed space collision, so please stay with us.
We've made it. Justice Jackson's appointment to the Supreme Court provides a beacon of hope.
Black women are underrepresented. We still rise. We still show up for one another.
It's us investing in the next generation and giving them something to enrich the next generation with.
NASA deliberately crashed a spacecraft into an asteroid about an hour ago. The agency also has delayed its Artemis 1 moon mission, again this time due to tropical storms. And the James Webb Telescope captured some out-of-this-world photographs of Neptune. Joining us to help understand it all is Mark Hammergren, an astronomer and planetary scientist at Farther Horizons. Mark, welcome back. So this crash...
Always happy to be here.
Thanks so much for joining us. So this crash happened a little bit more than an hour ago. How did it go?
Oh, spectacular. I was watching it while I was on another Zoom meeting, and I'm afraid I might have been a little inappropriate because I started cheering and pumping my fist. So it went perfectly.
So very exciting, I'm sure. I doubt it was that inappropriate. So an asteroid has been crashed into. Now what happens? Now what do we do? What do we know?
Well, now the real work begins, in a sense. The goal of this mission was to test a method of planetary defense, and it's as important as that sounds. This asteroid itself wasn't heading towards Earth, but we have to figure out what we could do if another one comes our way. We don't know of anyone coming our way. But what this spacecraft did is smacked into the asteroid, or rather the asteroid's little moon, and it's going to alter its course just a very little bit. In practice, in the real use of this, it would possibly, hopefully, deflect an asteroid from impacting the Earth.
So you talked about planetary protection. What could this mission tell us about planetary protection?
Well, nobody has ever tried a test like this before. And one of the big unknowns about asteroids is, what is their internal structure like? How do we go from an impact, from smacking into it, to this velocity change that is necessary for moving it away from the Earth? And that is something that we will get from follow-up observations from ground-based telescopes. And those will be key over the next weeks, months, years or so to figuring this out.
Mark, why was this specific asteroid chosen?
A few reasons, really. First is it's a near-Earth asteroid. That's a term that NASA uses for asteroids that come within a few tens of millions of miles from us. This one was making a close approach by Earth, 11 million kilometers, and around this time. So it was well situated for an impact like this. And also, this is a binary asteroid. It's got a moon that goes around it, and smacking the moon will alter its course more strongly over its primary asteroid than just deflecting a big asteroid around the sun.
Just 11 million kilometers away. So how do we tell if this mission was successful? Obviously, the collision happened, but how do we measure whether or not that velocity and course have been altered?
Yeah, so because this moon orbits around its primary asteroid, we'll be able to look at the timing of its orbit and where it is in its orbit around the asteroid. That will evolve or change more rapidly than, say, an asteroid going around the sun. So the time scale for changes will be noticed in really only a matter of weeks. So ground-based telescopes, which are plentiful and relatively cheap, will be used to augment this mission.
So we know that NASA has also delayed the Artemis 1 moon mission, this time for a third time. Talk us through what's causing these delays.
Yeah, so it's almost kind of like when your flight gets delayed. It's either a weather or equipment delay, and the first delays were equipment related. This one is weather related. The storm Ian is coming towards Florida. Cape Canaveral, Kennedy Space Center is going to be affected by high winds. And they made the tough decision to roll the rocket back to the vehicle assembly building for protection. And I say the tough decision to make that because that's going to add at least a week and maybe more to the time frame for rescheduling that launch. It's no small feat to move a rocket that's taller than the Statue of Liberty back into a building.
Yeah, I can only guess. Remind us, what's the goal of the Artemis 1 mission?
Artemis 1 is really the first test the first test in going actually to the moon of NASA's new giant rocket system. It's the one that will very soon, a couple of years, take people back to the moon to land. And so this is a very essential test. It'll go around the moon a couple times and then come back to Earth. It's an end-to-end test of the whole system, making sure that everything works right before people are sent up.
And Mark, we also know that the Webb telescope, it's captured a clear view of Neptune's rings for the first time in decades. What are some of the differences between these photos and the ones that were caught by the Voyager 2 back in the 80s?
Yeah, so Voyager 2 was really a great test. People knew that Neptune had rings or ring arcs because when it passed in front of stars, they saw dips in light caused by the rings or ring arcs. So the question was, hey, does it have full rings or small sections? Turns out kind of both. That's what Voyager saw. But the question after that was, how do those ring arcs change over time? And it's really tough to get that from using ground-based telescopes. But JWST provided a spectacular image in near-infrared light. That's where it dims the light coming off of Neptune and brings the rings into sharper focus. And they saw what looks to me, a quick look, that some of those ring arcs are no longer there. So that's going to keep astronomers busy for, I think, probably years now.
And we should also clarify, as we're looking at pictures while you're speaking, we're seeing Triton, which is actually Neptune's moon. Looks like a star. It's not a star, it's a moon. Right?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, good to fact check. What can these images, Mark, tell us about, other distant planets that are similar in Neptune size in about 30 seconds?
Yeah, so Neptune is a very distant, the most distant planet in our solar system. It's a so-called ice giant, and we have astronomers have discovered Neptune-sized planets around other stars. Similar to studying other planets in our solar system, it allows us to figure out what these extrasolar planets may be more like than having to really detect what they actually are like. So studying what's near tells us more about what's far.
Good to know. And it sounds like the last time we actually had good pictures of Neptune back in the 80s, Pluto was a planet. That's not the case anymore. Mark Hammergren, thanks so much for joining us.
Always a pleasure.
And there's more Chicago Tonight just ahead, so stick around.
Coverage of science and technology on Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Joel M. Friedman, president of the Alvin H. Baum Family Fund.
And still to come on Chicago Tonight, as the value of the yen rapidly plunges, Chicago-based McDonald's hikes prices in Japan. A look at the impact abroad and locally with Cranes. A U.S. task force is recommending adults under 65 get screened for anxiety. We look at how anxiety can emerge. And rededicating a local park after a German Jewish poet who died in the Holocaust. We hear from local residents behind the effort. But first, some more of today's top stories. The 3-year-old boy who was allegedly pushed into the water at Navy Pier last week by his aunt has died. Victoria Moreno has been charged with attempted murder and is being held without bail. The Chicago Police Department today offered condolences and said it would be up to the Cook County State's Attorney to make a decision on upgrading the charges.
Our hearts, prayers, and just our sincere condolences goes out to the family of that 3-year-old toddler. But what I can say is that at this point, the charging updates would be up to the State's Attorney's Office. The Chicago Police, we've investigated. That individual has been charged with the attempt murder. So as far as an upgrade, that will be left up to the State's Attorney's Office.
The Cook County Medical Examiner's Office confirmed the boy, now identified as Josiah Brown, was pronounced dead at Lurie Children's Hospital at 10:16 a.m. Sunday, nearly a week after he was pushed into Lake Michigan. John Rowe, the former CEO of Exelon, who turned it into one of the largest utility businesses in the country, has died at his home in Naples, Florida. Rowe helmed the company through the deregulation of the power industry and is credited with keeping the headquarters here in Chicago. He was also civic-minded, co-founding 2 charter schools and serving on the board of many venerable Chicago institutions, including the Field Museum, the Illinois Holocaust Museum, and the Illinois Institute of Technology. Rowe was 77. CTA ridership is bouncing back as more and more people are returning to the office. The Chicago Transit Authority says weekly average ridership has topped 900,000 riders in each of the last 4 weeks. That's the first time ridership has been above 900,000 since February 2020, before the COVID pandemic began. The numbers of riders in September is up 10% from the same period last year.
Paris, thank you. Good news for those apartment hunting in downtown Chicago. More power and goodwill for airline passengers under a new federal proposal. And Chicago-based McDonald's hikes prices in Japan. Here to go behind the headlines is Crain's Chicago business editor Ann Dwyer. Ann, welcome back. So let's start with that story about the downtown apartments. Rents are still on the rise overall, but is this a good time to move out of move to the heart of Chicago price-wise?
Well, I wouldn't want to sell downtown Chicago as a bargain right now. The news really is that in the second quarter, rents per square foot for Class A apartments hit a record level. But really what's happened that should be encouraging to renters is that the growth that we've seen over the past couple of years has started to moderate. The prices for a downtown Class A apartment, those are like new construction apartments, are up 7% this year compared to this time last year. That's on top of a 19% increase the year before. It's still a landlord's market, though, with occupancy downtown hovering above 95%. That's the highest we've seen in a decade.
Meanwhile, President Biden set to unveil new regulations for airlines that would benefit passengers. Can you preview for us what that would entail?
It looks like carriers and travel agents and online ticket sellers would all have to display the costs related to baggage options, seat changes, cancellations, etc., upfront and in a much more transparent manner than they're required to do now under these new proposed rules. Right now, they're only required to put the range of these prices up on their websites, and these fees can really add up. The airlines, in fact, make billions of dollars a year on just this type of fee structure, so you can bet that any change is going to really be scrutinized by Chicago's own United Airlines.
And lastly, Chicago-based McDonald's is hiking prices for Big Macs and some other items in Japan. Why is that, and what's the impact back at home?
You know, it's the same thing that's hitting companies all around the world. Inflation and the rising cost of raw materials. Those are the reasons why McDonald's Japan says that they're going to be raising prices significantly on more than half of their menu items. The other factor is the weakening yen. Currency fluctuations have really made it tough for them to keep their costs under control. So that is really the story in Japan, and it's the story in a lot of McDonald's markets. You know, as for how it's affecting business here at home, I suppose if you're a McDonald's shareholder, you have to be happy that the company is looking for ways to offset these costs as long as it doesn't suppress demand too much.
And of course, if you're buying a Big Mac in Japan, it's going to cost you more. Ann Dwyer, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Brandis.
The U.S. Preventative Services Task Force, an independent panel made up of healthcare specialists, is recommending that adults under 65 be screened for anxiety. According to the Anxiety and Depression Association of America, anxiety disorders are the most common mental illness in the U.S. It affects 40 million adults, or about 20% of the adult population every year, and yet it often goes undiagnosed and untreated. Joining us now is Inger Burnett Ziegler, Associate Professor of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Northwestern University's Feinberg School of Medicine. Inger, welcome back and thanks for joining us. How significant would you say this recommendation is?
I think this is a really important step forward in terms of the early screening and detection of common mental health conditions. This has been a part of the preventive services recommendations for depression for the past several years. And as you noted in your introduction, anxiety conditions actually are more common than depressive disorders. So I think that this is a really important step.
Why people under 65? What about those who are over that age?
Well, we know that people under 65, young adults, as well as those who are middle-aged, are more likely to have anxiety conditions, a variety of different types of anxiety conditions. So I think that focusing the attention there really makes a lot of sense.
The World Health Organization released a report earlier this year that the global prevalence of anxiety and depression increased by 25% during the COVID pandemic. You and I have talked about this a good bit over the last 2.5 years. How can stresses from the pandemic develop into anxiety?
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize the relationship between stress and anxiety. We know that stress is often brought on by an environmental trigger, usually something that's pretty acute, like the pandemic. And anxiety can then develop when stress is poorly managed or is not managed at all and becomes internalized. And so thinking about the stress that people have been dealing with over the last 2 years, it stands to reason that that stress has persisted, and many people now are likely facing anxiety conditions as a result of that.
Now, the draft recommendation from the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, it also specified pregnant and postpartum people get screened for anxiety. Why the special emphasis on that population?
Again, I think a lot of attention has been placed on pregnant and postpartum depression. However, we know that anxiety during pregnancy and postpartum is also quite common. Additionally, it's important to recognize that anxiety and depression often go hand in hand. So many of those who are experiencing a depressive condition, whether they're pregnant or not, are also having symptoms of anxiety. I think the relationship between the two hovers around 40%. 40% of those who are depressed are also anxious and vice versa.
When we talk about anxiety, Inger, how does this differ from stress?
Yeah, so anxiety is this persistent global fear and worry that is out of control and out of proportion to the event at hand. Whereas stress, when the stressor goes away, the stress tends to go away. For anxiety, it's become internalized, and it's this global overwhelming condition. So for many of the symptoms overlap. We know that anxiety has these cognitive symptoms, that fear and worry, these physical symptoms, feeling tightness, tension, uncomfortability in the stomach, as well as behavioral symptoms where it might be difficult to fall asleep. And so while there's a lot of overlap, there are some distinctions as well.
What are some of the common kinds of anxiety that health professionals might look for?
So we think about anxiety as kind of this broad disorder, but some of the specific types of anxiety are this generalized anxiety, that global worry that I mentioned, but panic disorder, social phobias, social anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder, even post-traumatic stress disorder. These are all anxiety conditions that fall within that broader category of a global anxiety.
What are some of the reasons that anxiety might, often go undiagnosed?
I think we live in a society where a lot of people kind of experience anxiety as the norm. People that are used to kind of worrying about things all of the time, or being afraid about things all the time, and are used to being able to function with a significant amount of baseline anxiety. And so to screen it is really important in terms of helping the individual realize that these are symptoms that with treatment they could get some relief from and also experience better functioning in their day-to-day lives.
Now, of course, there's diagnosing anxiety and then there's treating anxiety. We've got about 45 seconds left, but folks in your line of work have had no shortage of that kind of work over the last 2.5 years. What can be done to counter the shortage of mental health providers?
Yeah, we know that most people that are experiencing anxiety disorders actually are not receiving treatment. Those that do receive treatment can receive, medications as treatment as well as therapy as treatment. Additionally, there are a lot of things that people can do independently to cope with some of the anxiety they might be experiencing, such as kind of taking a closer look at their own thoughts, some behavioral breathing exercises or other stress management techniques. But indeed, it's true that as more people are getting referred to therapy, there aren't enough providers to meet the growing need.
Okay, a lot of work to be done. Ingrid Burnett-Ziegler, thanks again for joining us. Up next, an old name but a new honoree. We learn about the rededication of a Chicago park. But first, a look at the weather.
Sunday evening marked the start of Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. Residents around Chicago's northwest side, Colmar Park, have been reflecting on the life and work of German Jewish poet Gertrude Colmar, who was killed in Auschwitz in 1943. Their neighborhood park, named after Colmar Avenue, was recently rededicated in honor of Gertrude Colmar.
And the fact that we are honoring her today, capturing and forever and memorializing her history, I think is, again, a great testament to who we are as a city, honoring our history, because her story is also our story.
But the rededication has sparked questions across the city. Who should parks be honoring, and what part do they play in how we tell history? And here to discuss that and more are Paul Chodzesner, the great-nephew of Gertrude Colmar, Mary Marwig, who led the 2-year effort to have Colmar Park rededicated, and her neighbor Dan Pogoszelski, who introduced Mary to Gertrude Colmar's writing and assisted in the rededication efforts. Welcome all of you here to Chicago tonight. So Mary Marwig, it's already called Colmar Park here because of it was named after a town, I believe, on the German-French border, rededicated now in honor of Gertrude Colmar. How did you come up with this idea?
I actually have to credit Dan. Dan and I have been friends for many years, and he introduced me to Gertrude Colmar. And Dan, do you want to give some backstory as well?
Sure. So my great-grandfather died in Auschwitz, and his son and my grandfather's 2 other brothers were in Auschwitz. And it just so happened they were teenagers after they were released. He ended up marrying a young girl who was resettled from Ukraine into what was once Colmar, which was Chodzish. And there, as local patriots, when I would talk to my cousins, they told me this great poet, Gertrude Colmar, her father came from our part of Poland. And this is how, in a conversation with Mary, wouldn't this be grand to do something like this? Mary's like, let's not have it just as an idea. Let's make it happen. And for that, myself, Jacob Kaplan, Daniel Egelweiss, Mark Dobrzycki, Michał Niemkiewicz, and of course, Paul will forever be grateful that she led the charge of the committee, and 2 years later, it happened.
And Paul Chodzesner, this is your ancestor, your great aunt. Tell us how you found out about this rededication of a northwest side Chicago park, because you're from all the way halfway around the world in Australia.
I am. Just a short trip across a few countries. Look, I saw a relative of mine in Berlin actually came across an article in the Chicago Book Club, which was written by Ariel. And she somehow, I don't actually know how, she found it and forwarded it to me. And immediately I reached out to the journalist, Ariel, who put me in touch with Mary. And I think that was nearly 2 years ago. And I suppose I came along for the journey. They did all the hard work, but it was just such a humbling experience for me overall, to have Gertrude recognised in this way as being a great German poet.
So you're referencing a Block Club Chicago report that you read in Australia. Mary, this was a 2-year process to basically rededicate the park with the same name. Tell us why this process took so long.
Well, I think it's important that we did our due diligence. And so the Park District came out with a process after neighbors were successful in renaming the Douglas Park a few years ago. And that's the group who actually inspired us to get started with this one. So we went through the formalized process. We got signatures during the pandemic, which is not as easy as you would think. I set up an online signatures form so neighbors could show their support that way. Then I went door to door around our neighborhood asking people on a piece of paper or slip to go online, send your support. And then we started collecting letters of support as well. And thankfully, so many people were ready to support this initiative. And we've got in the first pass, we got over 50 neighbors within like a few days show their support. And then once we got the news articles, it just went viral. So not only just hyper-local neighbors, but more Chicagoans, and then international support in that. And then we met Paul, and that really turned things around for us. The Park District has been great. They've been a wonderful partner. They were instrumental in making sure the event last Thursday went so beautifully. So they've been excellent throughout this entire process.
And Dan, Mary, you mentioned Douglas Park inspired you. Of course, Douglas Park was initially named for Stephen Douglas and then renamed for Frederick Douglass. So they had to add an S in there. So similar situation where the name kind of stayed the same, but honoring a different person. Dan Pogoszelski, tell us about who Gertrude Colmar was and what her poetic legacy is.
Sure. So Gertrude Colmar, she is the most renowned German Jewish poet of the first half of the 20th century. Unfortunately, she was only recognized after her death, and she was murdered in Auschwitz. Her father, Ludwig, was no less talented as a lawyer, and so you could say that gift of the gab came from there. They came from a line of very well-known folks, whether it was the Hegestners or the Schoenflies family, and something that I grew up with, even though she wrote in German, something that the Polish community in Poland or here was incredibly proud of. And one of the things that was great is that we had the Polish consul, Polish television showed up, and even had folks that just had heard about it and a letter from the Polish Museum of America. So it was beautiful because it brought people together, German, Polish, but also people that were Asians, people that were African American, who just wanted to show tolerance, and that was beautiful.
And Paul Trzesner, what has this meant to your extended family that this dedication is taking place here in Chicago?
I'm struggling for words, really. The emotion it brought out on Thursday, the attention that it got. The Trzesner family is a very small one. I have a brother and a sister in Australia, and we have children, and I have a cousin in Brazil who is quite old now. It's meant a lot. My children are showing interest. There is definitely a whole connection back to Chicago, and some of my kids have already reached out saying they want to come over and see it, and it's a special reason to come. And for the work that the team did, it's amazing. It sort of came out of the blue, and it just gained momentum, and it's humbling. I'm just a little bit lost for words with it all.
Yeah, and bringing together a family that's clearly around the globe. Mary Marwig, we mentioned at the top that there's all kinds of debates in Chicago about statues, monuments, street names, park names. How important is a park name to educating folks about history, and who should parks be named after?
It is a great question, and I want to say this experience just shows how important that is. Some people might say you named the park the same exact name that it was. Yes, but there's meaning behind that name. This park is now Gertrude's Park. And through this entire experience, we were able to meet Paul. And we have a very deep relationship now. Paul and his family, they're honorary Chicagoans. They're always welcome back here. I actually hope you come and see Gertrude's tree. We planted a memorial tree. It's a very small tree, but I want you to come back every 10, 15 years and check up on that and see how it's doing and catch up with the neighborhood. So yeah, my message is it may seem like a small change, but it has had literally global reverberations. We have met Paul, we have met people from Europe, South America, and they now know that Chicago is a welcoming place that has promoted tolerance, and people care about righting past wrongs. And there's a generation of people here who are willing to put in that hard work to make that happen.
Dan Pogoszelski, we only have a couple seconds left, but I want to get you in here. I mean, because there's debates around a street like Balbo, named after a member of the former Italian Fascist Party. Should those kinds of names go away in favor of positive figures throughout history?
We should have where Chicagoans should weigh in to make sure that we right past wrongs and to reflect the kind of city that we ought to. And Chicago City, where community organizing was born, isn't this a beautiful thing that a community came together and hopefully empower others to do just that?
Right, this was a community process and it involved community input, because parks can't just go out there and willy-nilly change the name just overnight. And congratulations to all of you. Our thanks to Mary Marwig, Dan Pogoszelski, and Paul Chudzisner. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Paris.
And we're back to wrap things up right after this.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Alexandra and John Nichols, the Jim and Kay Mabey family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
And that is our show for this Monday night. Please join us tomorrow night live at 7.
A look at the role of charter schools in addressing student trauma and violence reduction in Chicago with the mother of Hadia Pendleton.
And the landscape and people of Puerto Rico are the focus of an art exhibit visiting Chicago from the island. And now for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Paris Schutz.
And I'm Brandis Friedman. Thanks for watching. Stay healthy and safe, and have a good night.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a Chicago person.